Welcome, everyone. I'll start with the housekeeping, potentially the most bland bit of the evening. There is no planned fire alarm, so if one does go off, then please gather outside the building and under the railway bridge until safe to re-enter. Yes, I always find this strange of the UK's obsession with fire. I'm from Australia and we never have these announcements. Anyway, more importantly, we are on to serious topics for the rest of today, and a great panel with us. Also, you've each on every seat, you have a feedback form. We are still somewhat beholden to donors as much as we are an independent thinking space. Please fill out the form at the end if you liked it. If you didn't like the event, just leave it. All right, so I'm Dustin. I'm the acting director of the Humanitarian Policy Group. Welcome to all of you. It's a great combination of people here and everyone online. Awesome to have you as well. We have an exceptional panel with us, and I'll do a brief introduction. First, we have Sana Kakia, who is the Executive Director of the Syrian Legal Development Program, who's been doing exceptional work over more than a past decade, and really kind of adapting to a rapidly changing context, which he will be talking about, and a lot around human rights, but also bringing human rights with humanitarian response. Then we have Kwebe Debare, who is the CEO of Trokra. They were involved and supported some of the research that we will be presenting this evening. Trokra has some operations in both contexts and is a very well-known Irish NGO with a very strong social justice lens. And we have Zoya Pan, who is the campaign director for the Burma Campaign UK and long-standing engagement in Burma resistance and fighting for justice, particularly for ethnic minorities across much of the borderlands of Burma that often get neglected when we focus too much on the core at the expense of the periphery. Awesome to have you here, Zoya. And my colleague and co-chair for this evening, Zainab Morlan, who will be presenting the research at the start, and then we'll be co-chairing together. All right, so that is the introductions. It is we created the title of the event before we knew there would be multiple meanings to rupture with everything that is unfolding, emanating from the West of here. So we're happy to discuss some of these dynamics because they obviously have existential implications for us as a sector. So please don't hold back on questions and interrogation of what this means for the sector, for humanity, and the future. We also, this is somewhat of a second event. We had a neglected crises event last year where we focused on Myanmar related to the anniversary of the coup, which is the 1st of February, and then also focused on Syria and, in that case, Somalia. Now we are kind of a second iteration of the event where we wanted to bring the two countries together again, and not so much about neglect, but about this moment of revolution and rupture. So we're happy to bring everyone together. Hopefully next year, we'll be talking about the downfall of the regime in Myanmar. All right, without further ado, that is enough from me. I will hand over to Zainab, who is going to briefly present some research that we just released yesterday. It is on our website. Do check it out. We've had some good feedback thus far. And without further ado, over to you, Zainab. Thanks.
Thank you, Dustin. Framed around the tensions between human rights and humanitarian relief, this study engaged with the many interconnected dimensions that on one hand appear irreconcilable and on the other hand offer new opportunities for rethinking how we approach humanitarian response and pursuits of social justice. Led by Dustin, myself, and Lean, the study focused on 4 distinct but interconnected case studies that highlight issues relating to civic space, resistance, and humanitarian response. The case studies, as you can see, were Ethiopia, Guatemala, Syria, and Myanmar. Due to time constraints, I will not be able to go over each individual case study, but will instead focus on key findings. First is the multi-mandate conundrum. Prioritizing a focus on advancement of rights or humanitarian relief was a central theme across the entire research process. even if rights and relief are not mutually exclusive. At a global level, there was a widely held view that the two areas are perpetually compartmentalized, with actors working in silos. This was also evident not just in donor funding, but also in the limited collaboration between rights-focused and humanitarian actors. While there's a common desire to deal with the structural drivers of crises and address rights abuses at some organizations, a focus on humanitarian relief typically prevailed. A second key takeaway was the issue of humanitarian principles and the depoliticization of civil society actors. Across interviews, there were strong views on the humanitarian principle of neutrality. These range from neutrality being a non-negotiable principle to being deeply problematic in the many global contexts where egregious abuses are occurring. Aside from the ideological dimensions of whether and how to address rights abuses, many interviewees also questioned whether neutrality even enhanced humanitarian access. This is because access restrictions and disregard for international humanitarian law and international human rights law were commonplace across not just the case studies, but in many other crisis contexts, including Sudan, Gaza, etc. Neutrality proved most contentious when imposed by international humanitarian aid actors onto global majority civil society actors, which was widely viewed as having a depoliticizing impact or disregarding locally led pursuits of justice. We also found criticisms focused on the foregrounding of service delivery to meet basic needs rather than social justice-oriented work. At a deeper level, there was widespread criticism regarding the NGOization of civil society actors. For those who are not familiar with the concept of NGOization, it essentially refers to the process by which formally informal or grassroots civil society groups evolve into formalized NGOs, often prioritizing external funding, professionalization, or bureaucratic structures. This can then lead to a shift away from grassroots activism, with NGOs focusing more on donor-driven agendas and, as a result, disconnected from the broader goals of systemic change and social justice. Nationwide, people's revolutions in Myanmar and Syria were first and foremost about political activism and emancipation. Humanitarian response therefore came out of necessity as a response to rising needs rather than being part of these actors' original intent. Many activists and networks are now, however, occupied with humanitarian response activities that detract from emancipatory activism and movement building. We also found that operating in fragile and conflict-affected states posed major challenges for international actors' ability and willingness to engage with state, governance, and policy issues. In Myanmar and Syria, international actors were criticized for avoiding engagement with de facto authorities. Instead, engagement with oppressive regimes like Myanmar's junta was criticized for legitimizing their rule. The broader conclusion essentially was that the international humanitarian sector remains too wedded to the concept of a single state entity. Yet contested governance is a growing reality across many contexts where de facto authorities are and should be treated as duty bearers. There were also specific critiques relating to the diversification, escalation, and adaptation of tactics. This was particularly the case when considering the unequal power dynamics between international aid actors and global majority civil society actors. We found many concerns that centered on how international actors encourage or discourage certain forms of resistance, while often being slow to react to contextual changes. For example, Guatemala revealed the importance of dynamic grassroots activism and networks, while Myanmar's escalation in different forms of resistance, including armed resistance, raised broad questions of where international actors stand and what should be their role. And finally, as we are all aware, the debates over aid funding are perennial. Across this study, the importance of long-term flexible funding was regularly highlighted, and Guatemala offered clear evidence of why it is important and the benefits it brings. In Guatemala, it contributed towards the building of long-term partnerships that created trust and mutual respect, while also enhancing international partners' legitimacy with activists and communities. Conversely, less flexible funding models in Ethiopia, Myanmar, and Syria were seen as an impediment to more creative and strategic ways of working. So, what does this all mean for the humanitarian sector? First would be advocating for improved funding modalities. Funding modalities, as I've just said, have major enabling or inhibiting impacts for addressing both relief and rights. As the case of Guatemala shows, relatively long-term and flexible funding has profound positive impacts, but it's increasingly rare. All international aid actors need to redouble their efforts to expand such funding. Second is to support civil society dynamism. Multi-mandate organizations should maintain and expand support to grassroots movements and civil society actors, as in Guatemala. For fragile and conflict-affected states, efforts should be made to provide such support or at least develop plans to transition towards such modalities to avoid being stuck in relief mode. Third is to systematically convene humanitarian and human rights dialogue and action. The division between relief and rights is tangible, but it can often be reduced or even overcome through improved dialogue and integrated thinking to guide action. Even in multi-minded organizations, this does not regularly happen. Fourth would be to overcome humanitarians' aversion to politics and to better engage with these realities. Putting the humanitarian blinkers on is easier, but it doesn't necessarily do justice to the context in which we operate. If localization, let alone decolonization, is to advance, it requires better allowance for supporting actors to navigate politics and to lead humanitarian response. And last, but certainly not least, expanding alliances for systems change. While the Charter for Change has achieved significant influence in promoting humanitarian localization, there is a distinct need for alliances to advance systems change towards addressing the issues raised today, such as concerns over individualization, debates over neutrality, etc. I'll stop there for now. Quick reminder, the report is out. So yeah, and you'll get a chance to download the full report at the end. And I will now hand over back to Dustin to get us started on the panel discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Zainab. And it was, yeah, really a fruitful, fascinating research process. And there's going to be a lot of uncomfortableness on the humanitarian and the human rights and other sides. But really, we're kind of trying to convene a lot of these discussions over an extended period. All right, Sana, first up. Syria is gone from neglected when we were here a year ago and now thrust back into global consciousness with the collapse of the regime. You were recently in Damascus. You obviously know what you're talking about. Please enlighten us on the current situation.
Where to start? First of all, lovely to see you all. A month ago, I might say, yes, it is a neglected, frozen conflict. We were discussing, me and Zoya, like a month ago, I was thinking on advocacy messages about how we can push states not to normalize with the regime, how we can push for better and improved sanctions to make sure that it is less impacting people on the ground and more impacting the regime. We were discussing innovative accountability measures to overcome the issue of impunity. However, today we are discussing how the institutions, how the constitution of Syria could be rewritten, what we want from the elections, how it will look like. So it's a whole different world for us. On the ground, the situation is, of course, very dire, very critical. It is a country that has been ruled under dictatorship for like over 50 years. For the last 14 years, we have a conflict, war, use of constant airstrikes, chemical weapons, detention centers, enforcibly disappeared people, displacement, a huge violations of HLP rights, housing, land, and property rights. There's an endless list of issues, and the situation, of course, will not improve very fast. However, I will say that it will need a lot of work, a lot of awareness, a lot of support as well, but also a lot of hope. We are hopeful. I am hopeful, but also we are not naive. There's a lot of work to be done. And at least we see that we can now start from point zero. Before, with a dictatorship and with a criminal regime, we had no hope, and we thought that we can't start anywhere. Now, at least we have a baseline to start from.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. you mentioned the term frozen conflict, which now is clearly been proven anything but. What does it mean for the international community when we talk about supporting pursuits of justice? There was a lot of fanfare about the revolution initially, the Arab Spring, but then kind of off the radar and a lack of engagement. What are some of the implications for us there?
So again, me and Zoya were discussing a few minutes ago that Syria, we thought that we had support from the international community. We had sanctions on the regime. We had specific states who supported the oppositions on the ground financially and other aspects of things. However, this didn't change the fact on the ground. We became more and more a trapped nation, and we are locked within the country, kept hostages. We can't leave, we can't go. I didn't visit for 9 years only because I worked in the humanitarian sector. Suddenly I became political because I was helping displaced people and I was forbidden from entering the country. So we thought that we are supported, but in reality we were not, because we were not seen and treated as people who only asked for basic human rights. We were treated as people who are intervening in politics, pushed to the side because we are talking about basic like freedom and the right to live and the right to speak and to express our needs. So in general, we always felt that we call it the orphan revolution, because it looked like it is supported, but in reality we had no one. And we always felt like we failed. The revolution already failed. A year ago, we will never imagine that this will happen. However, because people kept pushing for the change, even from within, this maybe was a good reminder for all of us to support each other and keep going. I'm not sure if you would like me to touch also on the fact that most of the humanitarian actors on Syria started as activists who took the streets and joined the peaceful demonstrations in 2011. Little by little, we became humanitarians because we needed to help the people who were targeted, displaced, attacked, and we were, of course, shifted from being activists calling for human rights and freedom to humanitarians who tried to help and to seek funding and to apply for endless requirements and applications from donors. And this, of course, shifted things. Additional to that, of course, it's the brutality of the regime. So we were not able to engage and stay as activists. We needed to shift our focus to other things. But humanitarian aid was mainly led and delivered by Syrian who used to be an activist before that.
So that raises an interesting point, because now the idea of civic space and resurgence of civil society, civil activity, now that the regime is gone, still is anything but assured. Yet there are also high degrees of humanitarian need. I was in Oman recently, and NGOs are flooding in, planting flags. Oh, we're back in Damascus. But what is your message to international actors as we evolve into this current situation? How can they support civic space, Syrian-led approaches to a post-regime Syria?
I think we have different scenarios, and we choose which scenario we will follow. If the international community wants Syrians to be an independent country, then the support that will be delivered to Syria should be strategic and should be for the benefit of a national, long-lasting peace, long-lasting economic stability. It shouldn't be a competition and each one coming and trying to impose specific vision while not trying to support a nationalized vision for the country. This is something very critical for Syria because as a country, it is a very rich country. And hopefully within a few years, we can become self-sustained and we can flourish and we can even expand our support to other nations. But if that approach of supporting humanitarian needs, not looking at a bigger picture about recovery, sustainable reconstruction, sustainable economic institutions, inclusivity when it comes to economic institutions and political institutions, if everyone started only to come and throw something and leave, then we might be in a humanitarian trap again. Because a lot of money entered the country in the last 13 years. However, it didn't improve the situation. There has been a lot of bad policies on the ground implemented, aid diversion. Unfortunately, international support was going to the wrong hands. A lot of corruption, a lot of entities, problematic actors getting funding. For example, procurement contract was signed between the UN and the hugely problematic actors, even people on sanctions lists for human rights violations that they committed against the Syrians. So so we need a strategy on how we will support Syria, and it should be a Syrian-led vision for the country. The whole world will come and support that nationalized vision. Hopefully, this is the best scenario and the best way to ensure the future is more bright.
Okay. Thanks, Sana. And just so everybody's aware, there is a Q&A, multiple rounds at the end, so keep your questions, write them down. I'm going to hand over to Zainab as we continue the discussion.
Yes, I want to turn us now to Zoya. I think you were nodding along to a lot of things that Sana was saying. I'm sure there's a lot of resonance, even though, you know, Myanmar is in a different part of its story. And it's anything but a frozen conflict, right? With 20 million people in need, 3.5 million people displaced internally, and God knows how many displaced outside of the country. So my question to you is, how is the situation shaping up in 2025?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me on the panel and listening to Sena. It is really inspiring for us, especially for activists and ethnic minorities and people in Burma, to see how the situation in Syria has changed so significantly. And that is so inspiring for us. That gives us hope. And we really hope that one day it will come to our country. And looking at the situation right now, yeah, there are so many things going on in Burma. And with more and more where ethnic revolutionary groups regaining lots of territories from the Burmese military. And many of them start to set up administrations or running more administrations in those areas and regaining more freedom in the area. And for the first time, we hear more and more about the discussion about how Burma will look like without Burmese military. And we have a real chance here. How Burma will look like without Burmese military. Of course, people in Burma are very exhausted. For Spring Revolution, it's been 4 years since the coup. And for ethnic minorities, for us, it's been decades. It's been more than 70 years. We've been struggling for our rights, for our self-determination, for our future, with very little or no support from the international community. But we don't give up. We keep going, we keep fighting for our survival, for our future, for our generation to come. And the positive thing at the moment is to see that international community begin to recognize the fact that ethnic minorities, our political bodies, and become that we are part of the solutions for the future of Burma. not just part of the problems, where in the past, most of the international community see us as difficult or problem implication, trying to get agreement between two Burma groups, like between the Burmese military and Burma group led by the NLD. And now we begin to see that more acceptance of the ethnic revolutionary groups and our struggle, and which is very positive thing. And the other thing I would like to mention here is very important, because later this year, the Burmese military is planning to have election in the country. They are so desperate for international support. They are so desperate to get more legitimacy from the international community. They will go ahead with or without the support of the people of Burma. And it is so important that international community understand this and not to recognize the Burmese military. And since the coup, we have seen the Burmese military is not smart enough to deal with the international community, but they have also played a divide and rule within Burma and within the international community. We have to make sure that we don't fall into that trap anymore. They are now very weak for the first time. The Burmese military is struggling for their own survival, and they will do whatever they can to keep on their grip on power, using humanitarian crisis as a mean, to create this crisis, to suck up the energy from the ethnic and from the resistance movement. And we have to make sure that international community don't neglect ethnic communities again in Burma, and have to work with ethnic community and the resistance forces there and the opposition and democracy movement in the country.
Thank you, Zoya, for that brilliant analysis. I really liked your point about whether the international community is helping or not, the people will continue, and I think they have no choice but to continue. But my next question, I think you've already touched on it, is you mentioned about support from the international community, but as the revolution progresses, what is urgently needed to enable the success of the revolution?
People in Burma need all sort of support, and we urgently need humanitarian support for the people in the country, across the country. The Burmese military deliberately targets civilians in many areas, deliberately create humanitarian crisis in all across the country. And we massively need humanitarian support for the people in Burma. The aid that we receive at the moment is not meeting the need on the ground. And aid donors have to be more flexible, working with community-based organizations, and make sure that marginalized communities have access to humanitarian aid, especially through cross-border area from different ethnic groups area. And this is just tackling the symptoms of the crisis. The root causes of the problem is the Burmese military and the political problem, and we need political solution to that. And in order to have that, we also need political pressure and economic pressure on the Burmese military. And people in Burma have been calling for more sanctions targeting the Burmese military and their cronies, and especially sanctions that will cut off their economic lifeline, including arms supplies and gas revenue and aviation fuel sanctions. The Burmese military conduct airstrikes and drone strikes, artillery shelling almost every day across the country, killing many, many people and creating huge humanitarian crisis. And we have over 4 million people now being displaced in the country. This is the highest number in Burma history. And in response to that, we need not just humanitarian aid, but also political pressure that will force the regime to end their violations against the people of Burma. We need to see targeted economic sanctions, including gas and oil sectors, to cut off their gas revenue and to stop their money that they use to buy weapons to attack people like us. And we need to stop their aviation fuel that they use to conduct airstrikes on the ground. And we also need neighboring countries, especially ASEAN, to stop their support on the Burmese military, because these countries, especially neighboring countries like China, ASEAN, India, their approach is in favor of the Burmese military, and they don't stop supporting the Burmese military, and we would like them to stop supporting the Burmese military. And in terms of humanitarian aid, to open up the border area to allow cross-border assistance to many people who only have access through the cross-border area because the Burmese military block aid from central part of the country. And not just aid, we need to see the neighboring countries to open up the border to allow trade and investment, because we don't want to rely on aid forever. We would like to rebuild our life. We would like to have trade and have development in our own ethnic area as well.
Thank you so much. That was very, very insightful. And as you said, yeah, political solutions. And I definitely have one final question from me, at least. What are your message for the aid sector? I know you said that there's political solutions to this political problem, but as we mentioned, relief versus rights, where do you think the aid sector fits into all of that? And what is your message to the aid sector?
Yes, at the moment, aid sectors can play a very, very important role to help us, especially the people in Burma. And I really appreciate many of you here and many aid organizations who provide aid for the people in Burma, because myself, I am a refugee. I was forced to flee from my homeland because of the attack by the Burmese army, and we fled into Thailand. I grew up in refugee camps in Thailand, and we completely dependent on international aid. And I was very lucky. I got scholarship. I went to university. I came to the UK as a student. And looking at the situation right now, the need for humanitarian aid, it is even more, not just in the refugee camps on the border area of Thailand, Bangladesh, and India, but also within internally displaced area and many areas especially in the ethnic area, they can only be reached through cross-border assistance. So please give us more humanitarian aid, and please be more flexible. We need more humanitarian aid, but we also need international aid agency and donors to reduce and stop their red tape, because it is killing people. Many civil societies in Burma and across the border area are now so busy with humanitarian crisis. And like Sana said, because this creation of humanitarian crisis and activists, even myself, I used to campaign a lot for political issue and political solutions, and now I have to deal with humanitarian aid on the ground, helping people there and linking up civil societies groups with different groups and providing advice and things like that. And it is a huge need. So we need donors and agency to be more flexible and to be more understanding of the new situation, and to work with all sectors. If they only agree to work under the Burmese military, and there will be many people who cannot access the aid under the Burmese military. The Burmese military not just block aid, but they also intimidate aid workers, and they tell aid agency where to go and who can receive aid. And it shouldn't be like that. So we would like you to increase aid and to be more flexible with the new approach, be creative. And if some of you work in Central Burma under the Burmese military, then cooperate with other groups who can work under the ethnic resistance area, there you can reach more people and save more lives.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much. I'll hand over back to Dustin now.
Thanks, Soya. Thanks, Zainab. Yeah, some really fascinating points, and obviously quite different messaging to what's been unfolding in the past week or two. So please take note. Kweve, I'll hand over to you. Trokra, navigates a lot of these issues of being a multi-mandate organization wanting to address social justice while also addressing the need for humanitarian relief. It'd be great if you could enlighten us, how as an international, one of these international aid actors, how do you navigate those tensions?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And firstly, thank you very much to Zana and Zoya for your articulation, which I think has been really, really compelling and really clear on the issues that face people in these very, very I suppose, contested and complex situations. But there's also hope, which is fantastic. So just to amplify a little bit, so TROCRA works in about 20 countries. When you say multi-mandate, I suppose what that means is we work across human rights and humanitarian areas. We work in support of partners. We have always been a partnership-based agency since our foundation in 1973. It goes to the heart of who we are. It is absolutely at our core. And partnership for us is much more than just how we operate. It is what we live in. It is what we breathe. It is everything to do with our identity is wrapped up in partnership and our belief in solidarity, our belief in subsidiarity, the taking of decisions at the right level. So partnership is very important to us, and therefore localization is very important to us. I've got three main points that I'd like to make, if that's okay. The first really jumps off from a point that Zoya made, which is divide and rule. So the first point, I think, is that it's useful sometimes to step back and to look at broad context and think about civil society space. TROCRA works a lot on civil society space, and we have a huge amount of experience in different contexts of seeing what unfolds. What tends to unfold in many, many contexts is that civil society space, and we did research in 2023 on this, is particularly constrained for people and organizations that are working on political issues, that are working on human rights, that are working in defense of human rights of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized people. And they are often the first targeted and the hardest targeted. And often what you observe in country contexts is that part of the sector is sort of seen as separate, and those who are working only in humanitarian response almost hold back, but in some ways can become instrumentalized by a government that ultimately in the long term would have as its aim the oppression of all forms of civil society. So routinely, and you can think of any example that you wish in your own mind of countries where you have seen initially civil society being oppressed, the human rights defenders, the political activists, the journalists, the lawyers who stand up and defend human rights, but then that extending to organizations being, as exactly as you described, being told, well, you can only operate here. You can only deliver humanitarian services in this government-controlled area. You can only deliver it in areas where these people vote for us and not for the opposition. Divide and rule is something that we see very, very commonly, and it happens where you have the humanitarian movement maybe stepping back. So this terrible stuff is happening to human rights organizations and human rights defenders. So we will, we will comply so that we maintain our space in order to be able to deliver much, much needed humanitarian services. But ultimately what happens is the humanitarian space also shrinks. And ultimately what happens is principles are compromised to a degree that really, you question whether, you absolutely fundamentally have to question whether things would have been different if the resistance had been there across the sector from the beginning. I'm conscious of time, so I'll go fairly quickly and then we can go straight to questions if you prefer. But the second point I'd like to make is around neutrality. So in the paper that we worked on with ODI, with the HPG group, and it was a fantastic process, and I highly recommend the paper. The title is A Humanitarian Trap. There is quite a bit of discourse within the paper about how contested neutrality is as a concept. And I think this is true. I think each and every one of us knows that if you want to have a good debate, bring up the concept of neutrality. For TROCRA, I suppose, as a social justice organization to our core, there's one quote which is very useful, and it's Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said many years ago now, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." We fundamentally believe that humanitarianism starts with humanity, and that there is no lack of congruence, as it says in the paper, between humanity and human rights, that these are absolutely interdependent and intertwined. So the principle of humanity is congruent with social justice. Neutrality, we TROCRA, as an organization that delivers humanitarian programs, almost half of our programming is humanitarian. We do it on the basis that we are operationally neutral. We are militarily non-aligned. We are completely neutral in terms of the political and military objectives that any actor to a conflict has. But we cannot be neutral when the cause of a conflict or the cause of a crisis is political and when it's unjust. So we will certainly take positions on the causes of crisis and on the impacts of crisis. And we don't see that that lacks congruence with humanitarianism at all. I'll just give you one quote that is very strong, and it came from an ODI event not long ago by Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who said, "If you stay equidistant from the parties in a genocide, you are no more, no less than Christian missionaries in a time of settler colonialism." And I think that statement, should be a challenge to all of us, to consider what is our moral stance in the context where there are clear injustices. And that does not mean to say that you depart from international humanitarian law. In fact, for Throker, it has meant that we have more than ever lent into international humanitarian law to defend the rights of people who are vulnerable in the context of crisis and conflict. And then my last point, and this is really about, the reality is that for international organizations, whether you're an NGO or a donor working in these contexts, an awful lot comes back to risk and risk management. First thing I'll say is that we've already heard from Sana and from Zoya about the kinds of risks that people experience at the grassroots, the kind of risks that you went through in your own life, for example. And they're simply escalating beyond belief. And this last 10 days has shown that they're going to escalate even further. But I genuinely believe that the stance that organization takes with respect to risk has a huge impact on whether or not organizations, be they international NGOs or donors, either increase the risk for local actors and local communities or somehow contribute to some reduction or mitigation of the risks. So for example, 3 examples of how risks can be increased. So if you require, as a donor, or as a UN agency or as any entity, if you require an NGO or a CBO to be registered with the authorities, and if through that registration, that local organization gets exposed to potential criminalization, which is the case in Myanmar, that is massively increasing the risk for that organization. If you require the use of formal banking systems, which exposes organizations who are operating maybe in a non-government controlled area to visibility and to sanctions and to criminalization, you're increasing the risk. If you ask organizations to do ordinary things in extraordinary times, like getting receipts, getting 3 quotes for your procurement, delivering those hard copy receipts so that there won't be any ineligible expenditure, you're increasing the risk because people have to travel people have to go and find a receipt, find somebody who will give them a receipt. That person might be compromised or might be exposed by just giving a receipt for something that's been delivered to an organization that is taking substantial risks in the context of a very serious crisis. So we in Throker, we have a risk appetite, which I think is very measured and very mature. So for example, we have close to 0 tolerance for the risk of management failures that would lead to situations of serious insecurity for our staff or for our partners. But we have a very high level of tolerance for risk related to ensuring that we support human rights work, including in contested and humanitarian contexts. That does not mean that we do not work very hard on mitigating those risks. It does. I think that's my point, is that the risk stance, the risk posture that an organization takes is absolutely fundamental, but it requires work. So if you're going to mitigate those risks for local partners, you do need to work hard, first of all, to understand the risks, to be listening, and then everything that both my colleagues have said around being able to respond with flexibility becomes very important. I'll stop there, Dustin, so we can move things on.
Excellent. Thanks, Quiver. That was perfectly articulated, I think. And let's just put this in the context of 90% plus of crises across the world are protracted crises. So how do we address rights, social justice, resolution of the crises rather than just being on this humanitarian hamster wheel forever? I'm going to hand back to Zainab, and we're going to throw it out for the first round of Q&A. So over to Zainab.
Alternate between the in-person audience and the online audience. We'll start with the in-person audience. So yeah, please put your hand up and our colleague Marika will come over with the mic.
Thank you for a very, very interesting discussion and lots there to agree with and to think about. My main background is working on Myanmar or Burma. So thank you, Thramu, for your insights and your analysis. I think one of the themes that really speaks to me from this discussion is the anti-politics machine, the way in, as you said, from the research in the 4 countries, sometimes the pressure on civil society organizations not to be engaged in politics. I think there is another element in the room, and that's the sort of anti-armed resistance machine. And it seems to me that, and this I'm building up to a question, one of the lessons, and I'm being intentionally simplistic and maybe provocative, but one of the lessons from the Myanmar conflict is that when anti-junta protesters took to the streets in non-violent resistance, that was an incredible period of, it showed how deeply unpopular the military coup was, and the resistance was incredibly admirable, but really quite unsuccessful. And it was only when civilian activists actually took up arms and became organized militarily through People's Defense Forces that they achieved the extraordinary success which Thramu Zoya was telling us about. Many people will probably have seen the BBC report in late December, which stated that the junta now controls only 20% of the country and that armed opposition forces control at least 40% of the country. That might be a bit of an overestimate, but it certainly indicates how things have shifted in the last few years. And really, the main reason why things have shifted so much is because of the military success of anti-junta forces. So my question is whether this is also the case in the other 2 countries in the study, in Guatemala and Ethiopia, because it seems to me that the big game changer in Myanmar for sure, and my understanding is in Syria, this is because of military success. And so I would want to add to the list, very comprehensive and that was presented by Thramu Zoya, that really what's required is direct military support, and particularly the ability to defend against airstrikes and other kinds of massacres which are launched by the Myanmar junta. So I guess I want to say that we need to get not only beyond the anti-politics machine, but we need to acknowledge that sometimes resistance has to take kinetic forms. And that, of course, is a moral and normative judgment. But it seems to be empirically the case that in Myanmar and Syria that the logjam was broken by military tactics and by armed resistance, not just by civil society organizations or political actors who had been present in Myanmar for many decades without having achieved much success, I would argue. So, yeah, the question is whether we can move beyond critiquing the anti-politics machine and suggest that sometimes military solutions are required.
Yeah, I think I'll answer that first question, and I'll hand over to Dustin to also respond. So in the context of Ethiopia, so I led the Ethiopia case study. I think that armed resistance was something that came up, but I think it wasn't armed resistance in the way that we understand it, more so sort of making synonymous armed resistance and politics, whether it was armed or not, right? And I think that this issue was like a double-edged sword in Ethiopia, because you have a government who is using politics as a way to like as a stick to beat humanitarian actors with, right? Like, you're not being neutral, and this is in reference to the Tigray war. Humanitarian actors are being accused of not being neutral, and then aid is being suspended. There are blockades and people being starved to death. And then you also have on the other side a government that's also curtailing the ability of humanitarian actors to even do much humanitarian work because of the fact that they're afraid of being accused of supporting the TPLF or whatever. So I think that whether we call it politics or we call it armed resistance, I think it differs in context to context. And I think in the context of Ethiopia, it is one where politics is the issue, whether people are using peaceful means or people are using armed resistance. It is inherently a political issue, and in the context of Ethiopia, I think the federal system and that's so intertwined with ethnic system is essentially, I think, causing a lot of problems. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I do think that yeah, I think in the context of Ethiopia, it was a bit more complex than just armed resistance. It's any form of resistance is completely not allowed. But I will move over to, I'll ask Dustin to chip in.
I'll just jump in briefly, but please keep questions short because then we can have more questions. I know there's obviously a glaring contradiction of in Ukraine, air defenses seen as a humanitarian imperative to prevent airstrikes, but this is not happening in Myanmar and did not happen in Syria. So where does that fit with the international community being able to prevent airstrikes, which are disproportionately carried out against civilians in breach of all international humanitarian law? So there's a clear contradiction there and a clear humanitarian imperative. But I'll leave it there. Maybe if Zoya or Sana, if you want to jump in, otherwise we can go to another question.
Yeah, I just would like to mention briefly how very little international support that Burma gets compared to any other countries like Ukraine or even Syria. Let alone military support, even humanitarian support and economic pressure or other political pressure on the Burmese military haven't been adequate. We need to see more than this. If we have even 10% of what we've seen in other countries, that will help a lot in our struggle. If we have complete sanction on aviation fuel against the Burmese military, and if we have sanctions on gas revenue and other revenues, and yeah, if we have enough sanctions that will hurt the Burmese military, it will be a huge help for our resistance in Burma.
Do we have any online questions? Okay. Any more questions? In-person audience?
Thank you, everyone. That was really, really interesting. I just had a question about the donors and balancing your risk appetite with the requirements of the donors. How do you go about doing that if they do have specific requirements and you obviously need to meet the needs of local organizations and SMEs? How do you go about balancing that? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So, well, let me give you a really positive example. So Throcra works with the Government of Ireland. We work with Irish Aid, and Irish Aid is a very progressive partner, not just to us as international NGOs, but to effectively through us to our local partners. So, you know, there are huge numbers of positive examples of what we are able to do with our local partners because we have the support of a donor that understands fundamentally the importance of protecting and promoting human rights in all contexts, that understands the importance of enabling civil society to survive through really difficult contexts. And that it may be many years, it might be 14 years, it might be longer before civil society can start saying, it is now time for us to build inclusive institutions. But we work with a donor that understands the long game, so we're very fortunate. So with Irish Aid, what we've been able to do is at a very practical level, kind of work out, well, in this context, which has maybe suddenly changed, be it the coup in Myanmar, be it the war in Gaza, what it is that our partners are telling us they now need. And then with Irish Aid, we have been able to negotiate shifts. So whether it's, if you like, almost like crisis modifiers, but much more fluid than that. We've been able to agree how we change the program in order to be able to meet the needs of the local populations that our partners are trying to reach and trying to serve. Now, that is obviously not the case with all donors. And that is why I think that it's very important. Like when I speak about risk, we have to acknowledge that donors there is an upward accountability, which is valid. We are all responsible and accountable for the money that we receive ultimately from the taxpayers. But, you know, managing risk does not necessarily mean having to do that in a top-down way. It means listening to the risk that is experienced at the bottom and adjusting systems all the way up in order to best mitigate the risk of the local partners. So I think, you know, what donors in this current context do need to do, but it's increasingly difficult, is to reconnect with the why of localization, to reconnect with the fact that by supporting local civil society actors, you're building long-term change. Civil society is an institution. Civil society deserves investment in and of itself, but also because it delivers through the work of civil society across the entire range, it delivers the best outcomes for civilians as well. So I think we do need to require of our donors and encourage and enable them to take that longer term vision and to translate it into systemic internal changes. So let me give an example of something that requires a systemic internal change. So I just said that we have these very positive experiences with Irish Aid in terms of being able to move money from one part of a program to another very fluidly. What becomes more difficult, and this is where donors need to have joined up systems. So even if the will is there to move the money from, you know, one part of a program to another, to have crisis modifiers, to have a nexus approach, it's much more difficult often for the donor to be able to use its own systems to change the accountability. So for example, in Gaza, at a certain point in the earliest stages of the war, we were not able to get the donor to come with us on the fact that we did not have receipts from our partners. We were not going to be able to get receipts from our partners for things that had been procured, for services that they had used, because their offices no longer existed. So that is an issue, that lack of joined upness. So if you have the program, which is fluid and which can move and which is nuanced, which is listening to the context, without the back end systems also being able to move and respond, you're never going to have a good system. So we do need ourselves as INGOs and donors to think about this in a systems approach. Everything within the system needs to work towards responding to the needs of the local partners.
Can I add to this? So in 2023, there has been an earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria. And unfortunately, the lack of flexibility by donors meant that some partners on the ground who tried to react very quickly to the victims of the earthquake were not able to move the money because the donors were asking for specific systems to be followed, specific due diligence to happen, which made it impossible for people witnessed a national, like a natural disaster to really meet their needs. This first developed a very much lack of trust between those partners and their donors, and also explained how those kind of entities should and need to plan properly for specific big events like an earthquake. Are we maybe those scenarios should be discussed as part of the risk assessment, that usually the donor is giving you a template for you to fill. Maybe they read it, maybe not. However, it is only a box that they need you to check. However, those kind of risks should be a process or an opportunity for the donor and the implementer and the partner on the ground to sit together, discuss those risks and see how those risks could be mitigated. In reality, the risk is only passed to the local partner without even addressing the resources needed for the local actor to deal with those risks. And here I'm not talking about only the compliance or the due diligence. I'm even touching on something called the human rights due diligence. Specific projects are implemented without understanding how they might negatively impact human rights. While we are thinking that we are delivering humanitarian aid to support the people in need, we might be jeopardizing specific human rights. So as part of the work we do at SLDP, we advocate for heightened human rights due diligence on different levels, from the donors to the implementers on the ground, because when you are working in conflict area, you might be intentionally or unintentionally contributing to the actual human rights violations happening on the ground.
Yep.
My question has to do with, again, donor flexibility, but this time round coming at it from private sector. So I come from a private sector foundation, and we are seeing, of course, more localization is being more beneficial, and sometimes whether that is in giving the funding or in providing in-kind services. So I work with a logistics company, and so sometimes it's been easier for us just to go directly to the civil society and nonprofits and say, what do you need moved from here to there, whether it's in-country or cross-border. And that side has been working really, really greatly. Unfortunately, though, from a corporate governance standpoint, our appetite for risk is not very, very high. And so our processes when it comes to grant funding is not the very best. But I'm curious to see whether any of you has seen some good flexibility or best practices on how private sector is engaging with regard to localization.
Please jump in.
I mean, the comment that I would make about the private sector is that typically the private sector will be much more entrepreneurial than traditional donors, and that includes international NGOs. So sometimes what we find is that the private sector will be more willing to move in and jump ahead with an idea that is innovative in nature because they can join the dots and they can see into the future. So for example, we're working on a big solar project in Sierra Leone. There's loads of risks involved in it, but it is also one of the most exciting projects that we have going. And we could not do that project were it not for the private sector element, that there is a private sector partner that's willing to come on board with Trócaire, with our local partners, with the funder, which is also Irish Aid, once again, you know, a progressive visionary donor. But the private sector element is the element that makes it work, because the private sector both understands what a market-based solution looks like, understands that it has to be sustainable on the basis of markets as opposed to on the basis that we traditionally work from. So I think engaging the private sector where the private sector has strength is really, really key. I also think sometimes, you know, challenging the private sector based on what we have learned from across the rest of the sector is important as well. So forgive me, but you know, if you were to ask organizations what they most need, if you were to ask people in humanitarian situations what they most need, it's flexibility. So that is why we do multi-purpose cash transfers. So while in-kind has its place and it's really useful and important, I think we should challenge ourselves to see, well, what else can we do that people really value, starting from what people value most, and then what it is that we can bring to that.
Thanks. Maybe we'll take one more question. Vera, I saw you had your hand up before. We'll take one more question in the room and then we'll go to online questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So there's experience from feminist philanthropists who believe that when you support women's rights organization, you should support, in times of crisis, you should support them to do delivering and responding to the crisis while continuing to pay for core actions and the core mandate of that organization. I just wondered if you had experiences of that or experiences of trying to engage donors, humanitarian donors in particular, around that notion of saying, well, we are a civil society organization. Our core mandate is not to deliver food or deliver cash, or it is actually to look at social justice and human rights and be part of the future of our country. And so, yeah, I just wondered if you had any experiences of non-feminist philanthropist organizations who also believe in this. I assume Irish Aid is like this, but also of any experience of trying to bring that up to a donor, and what kind of conversation are happening? What are their worries around this? What are the things that they bring back to you saying, we can't because? What are the reasons? I'm just curious to know if you have any experience of that. Thank you.
Maybe Zoya or Sana, if you want to speak to this.
I can touch on it a little bit. As a human rights organization, when we apply for any grant, it will be because the donor is interested in accountability or human rights. So I think the discussion, the first part of your question is not applicable for us because there is a specific programs where we can go and apply under specific themes, including like accountability and justice. However, we are always in that mode where we try to focus our activities on specific direction, while maybe the donor will not be very keen for us to go in that direction. One of them, for example, is related to sensitivity they might have on the political level. Maybe if we are discussing sanctions, but they are seem as like neutral nation, so they don't want really to fund any projects related to that problematic aspect of things. Also, it might be reputational risk that they might be facing because they are seen as a state supporting human rights activists. So in the case of Syria, we know that the Syrian regime used the point about giving access to specific people working for the UN or for foreign ministries. For example, they didn't issue visas because they knew that this entity is supporting, for example, a human rights organization working on Syria. However, it is more about trying always to find that space where you push the boundaries if you are to focus on human rights and if this is your core values. Unfortunately, with the case of Syria, Syria was always dealt with as a humanitarian crisis, while in reality, it is a human rights crisis that led to a humanitarian crisis. A lot of donors didn't touch on the grass roots and the root issues that caused the humanitarian crisis, which ended up being very shallow and only touching the surface with the interventions that used to be implemented.
Thanks, Sana. And I think also some of the informal mutual aid is like some of the most dynamic work that we're seeing, yet kind of gets neglected from a lot of these conversations. At the same time, we have global philanthropy who support a lot of dynamic processes, but when we become more and more reliant on philanthropy, that's a reflection of just the deep structural inequalities, and the concentration of wealth we see is escalating severely across the world at the moment. So donors really have a lot to learn from these different modalities, whether it's mutual aid, the informality of that, supporting, getting behind that, philanthropy, being willing to take risks, do things flexibly. You know, the mainstream donors really should be getting on board with that as well. I'll hand over to my colleague who's going to run through the online questions. Thanks.
So we're finally going to address the elephant in the room. There has been a question about US aid. This question is specifically, I think, about kind of what does this mean for funding? But I actually think the interesting part of that question is, you know, you talked about what more international support there needs to be. And what does this mean with the US kind of pulling away? What next for these movements, and what more can other international actors be doing to step up? And then I think linked to that is an interesting question around the role that different states play in their own countries in terms of support from local campaigners and activists. So for the UK, for example, what can all of us who operate in the UK context be doing to drive support for our government to support these movements? So I think that moves us away slightly from the funding debate, but I think they're quite interesting questions about what more international actors need to be doing to drive these changes beyond just funding as well.
Maybe Zoya, could you jump in on the funding, because you're, you know, the need for more funding is so urgent, yet headed in the wrong direction.
Yes, just recently, as we all know, the crisis that happened around the world due to the US aid announcement, especially the refugee camps where I came from. I've been in touch with many people there because they were raising concerns. NGOs that run healthcare and water and bin collections have all been seized. And there's been crisis because those hospital facilities were not allowed to be used by patients, and patients who were sent to other hospital because of their serious illness, they have to be stopped as well. And this has created huge concerns and worry among refugees along the border of Burma and Thailand and other areas as well. And This is so important for us that the US aid continue and reinstate this aid, emergency aid for refugees there, and for the implementation to happen as soon as possible. At the moment, we understand that in refugee camps, those facilities are still being closed and not opened. And patients seriously need support for that. And meanwhile, we would like to see more aid coming from other organizations, other governments as well, and be more flexible and be more creative. For example, after the coup in 2021, instead of diverting aid to other humanitarian sectors or to other purpose, the aid from NGOs were being freezed. And as a result, many people on the ground, they didn't receive those aid. And for organizations who were meant to receive those aid, and when they were asking for repurposing the aid, they had to fill in so many forms. And despite they are on the run and they are at risk of being arrested, being tortured, and being killed, they were still asked to fill in so many forms to redirect those funding. And this is unacceptable, because if we really care about saving life, I think international NGOs and donors have to start thinking about more working flexible on the ground and having a local-led approach rather than top-down approach. And we need to see the UK government and others to increase more aid in Burma and to impose more targeted sanctions on the Burmese military, especially aviation fuel sectors. We have seen some limited sanctions on Burmese companies delivering fuel to the Burmese military, but we also need to see sanctions on international companies as well, not just Burmese companies.
Yeah, look, it's a really challenging question. I suppose it's less than 2 weeks, everything has changed. Everything has changed. Our entire sector is incredibly vulnerable, and it just seems unconscionable, to be honest, what is happening. There's a huge amount of confusion, there's a huge amount of disarray, but the risk and the threat, given the importance of the US in terms of the overall aid sector, the humanitarian sector, is absolutely enormous. There's a number of things that I'd say about it, maybe just one is that the impact will be catastrophic. It'll be catastrophic for those people who are affected. Hopefully that number of people will be minimized, but it could be a very serious number of people. What role can states play? What role can other states play? Well, the first thing that I'd say is that, prior to this situation, prior to the 20th of January, we already had a situation where the global humanitarian overview was projecting a significantly high number of people whose needs would not be met because they could not, even in the appeal, did not feel that they could ask for enough money to meet the needs of everybody that was identified as being in need. And that was a suppressed estimate as well. But it's not because there isn't enough resources in the world, there is. So one of the things that might arise as a result of this really, really acute situation now, which is potentially catastrophic, is that we have to seriously think, not just as a sector, but as governments that are committed to core principles of humanity and also stability in our world, of other sources of financing to ensure that people can access the basic services that they need, that they deserve, and that they have a right to. So innovative sources of financing is a topic which is discussed a lot in climate circles. It's now even more acutely urgent that innovative sources of financing, things like the polluter pays principle that's often talked about in the climate environment, that we now actually bring this more into the mainstream and really significantly interrogate where the resources that are being spent in this world are going and why we as citizens, our taxes are being used to give support and subvention to industries that are deeply damaging, not just to ourselves, but to people who are most vulnerable across the world, whether that's subsidies to fossil fuels, whether that's huge investments in military. These things now need to be questioned. So we as citizens globally, we have a role to play to challenge our governments on that. I think also we have a role to play in challenging ourselves. over the course of the last 10 days, I think what we have seen is the risk that we as a sector obey too quickly and too easily and do not challenge back. The stop work orders came out of the blue. They were a shock. We knew that there was going to be something, did not know the extent, the scale, or the suddenness of it. At the same time, what appeared in general to happen was a collective drawing back because of risk, because this creates a huge, shocking, existential risk to so many organizations, but a huge drawing back and a stopping of work across the sector, resulting in a stopping of salaries being paid and a stopping of services without us actually knowing, is that fundamentally required? And in the context where people have legally signed contracts that require them to spend the money, deliver the service, and have the staff. So I think something that is useful to reflect on is don't obey in advance. As Timothy Snyder said in his book from 2017, from the first Trump administration, it's well worth going back and looking at that book again. He said, don't obey in advance. That is one thing that you can see throughout the patterns of history led to tyranny becoming entrenched. Things like protect the institutions. I think our colleagues in the United States, another thing that we can do as people broadly on this side, there may be colleagues in the States listening, is support civil society in the States to protect the institutions that will protect people. And to have courage. That's the last chapter in Timothy Snyder's book, and I think it's the one that we should hold dear to our hearts, because none of this is going to be easy, and we're all going to be challenged, but we need to look beyond our own organizations, work collectively in alliances, and certainly advocate towards our own governments to step in and to do more than just fill the vacuum, but actually think of new ways of doing things.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, the alliances are really critical, and also avoiding the tendency in the sector towards self-preservation of own institutions, particularly international actors. When a lot of what we're talking about is the dynamism and supporting civil society dynamism that is represented here. We're actually getting close to running out of time. So we're going to do a final round of reflections from everyone and allow a bit of time for a chat afterwards and wrap things up shortly. So Sana, a lot of different topics. We didn't necessarily delve that much into sanctions as well. There are so many dynamics going on in Syria, but I guess what are some of your final reflections or key messages, considering all we've been talking about?
I think, yeah, we need to rethink how the humanitarian aid is delivered around the world. We touched on many things. But we need to rethink how the process is, how the whole process is going on, because in many ways we were facing that issue about neutrality, for example, in Syria. Being neutral caused many lives after the earthquake to be left alone, because there has been that over-interpretation of international law and the sovereignty of the state, and without the approval of the regime we cannot access. The regime didn't ask for that support, and we ended up, to be honest, violating international humanitarian law, because the law is very simple, is telling you you need to take all the steps needed to save lives. This didn't happen. So I'm not sure how this is even acceptable for us to be happening all over the world and not being challenged. So sometimes maybe vocabulary like neutrality need to be reanalyzed and redefined and redisseminated after understanding what we did wrong. It's very easy for different institutions to say we want to stay neutral, while they don't really see that if the other side is politicizing aid, you cannot stay neutral, because you will be automatically politicized because you are interacting with a hugely politicized entity. So these kind of reflections are pretty much needed, because it will help us to feed into each other's experiences, each other's failures, and each other's deep bad experiences that we had. For example, in Syria, we have many lessons learned to give the world. Hopefully, it will. Hopefully, the world will listen. But I can't stop. There's a lot of bad examples about how humanitarian aid was dealt with in Syria, and I hope it will not happen somewhere else.
Thanks, Sana. Zoya, if you were to jump in.
Yes, 20 years ago, we were told that if international aid agencies provide cross-border assistance through neighboring countries, it would fuel more conflict in the country. Look at now, with or without cross-border assistance, the conflict is there and even getting bigger because of the root causes of the problem, which is the Burmese military. And lack of ending impunity has resulted in more and more human rights violations and conflicts in the country. The Burmese military has been committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, has been violating international laws for so many decades, but there hasn't been any strong legal action against them. That's why Burma is in this situation right now, a complete humanitarian crisis and human rights violations all over the country. And we need this to end. We need more support from the international community. People in Burma are so desperate for more humanitarian aid, and especially grassroots organizations are doing everything they can to survive and to help their communities, and now to rebuild our own community. No matter what the Burmese military or dictatorship do to us, we will not give up. Whether Burmese military or civilian government, ethnic minorities in Burma have always been persecuted and being under attack. And international community must wake up and must understand the situation and must stop neglecting the ethnic minorities in Burma and stop neglecting humanitarian crisis in the country. We have over 21,000 political prisoners in Burma right now, the highest in my life, in our history. And this needs to end. So we need more support from you, whether with or without your support. People in Burma do not have a choice. We have to continue to fight for our freedom. Like in Syria, like in Ukraine, like in Bangladesh and other countries, people in Burma are trying to win back our freedom and to rebuild our life. And we would like to make sure that this generation is the last generation who suffer under Burmese military dictatorship. And we need your support for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoya. Quiver, final thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, just my final thoughts, I think, just to wrap up, are that I think our responsibility as NGOs, as donors, is number one, to rethink risk, to think about risk from the bottom up. So to think about the risk that affects the person most acutely affected by crisis and work to resolve that risk rather than from the top down. The second thing I would say is really to focus on quality funding. So we often hear about multi-annual funding, flexible funding, but that funding also needs to be very much systematically quality funding, so that every element of the funding is in service of the people who are dealing with rapidly changing, volatile, incredibly difficult and incredibly dangerous situations. So high quality, flexible, multi-annual, but also timely, low administrative burden. We've heard examples of how the administrative burden actually puts people at greater risks and denies them. And, you know, delayed humanitarian assistance is humanitarian assistance that's denied. That's fundamentally the case. I think finally, coalitions for change. You know, we're now at a moment of inflection in this world. We haven't seen such a serious situation for some time, and that is saying something. So I think now more than ever, we need to build coalitions for change and try to be as effective as we can together.
Thanks. Excellent words as well. Zainab, you started us off with presenting the research, and now we've had a lot of discussion. Please tell me your final thoughts.
Thanks, Dustin. I have a few reflections and last night I was watching, I think a lot of you probably have been watching a lot of Palestinians in Gaza being reunited with families and displaced people going back home. And, you know, it made me think of a quote that I read last year, which was that the humanitarian sector places Palestinians on life support. You know, every few years they face, you know, death, destruction, and ethnic cleansing, whatever you want to call it, genocide. And, you know, the humanitarian sector steps in and puts them on life support, and then the cycle repeats itself. And it made me think about, you know, today we spoke a lot about principles. It made me think about the do no harm principle. You know, to what extent do we think about how much engaging or not engaging with civic actors, we being humanitarians, by not engaging with civic actors, how much are we doing more harm than good? And to what extent are we creating a job for our future selves, for future generations? And another principle it made me think about was, Kiva mentioned earlier about the principle of humanity. You know, we always talk about neutrality, how it's contentious, etc. But I think what we can all agree is that humanity is a principle that bridges that gap, right? That perceived gap between human rights and humanitarian relief. And it rejects this binary approach that sees immediate short-term humanitarian assistance over there and, you know, long-term social justice and reconciliation, reconstruction over there. And I think that if you do not address the structural drivers of crises, or at least speak on it and acknowledge that they exist, I think that, you know, it's an incomplete job and as humanitarians. So I would like to think that humanity encourages us to see the people that we're helping or supposedly helping as whole individuals, people who are not only recipients of aid, but rights holders, people who are active participants in shaping their own present and their own futures. So I do really hope that, you know, today's panel and the report, make sure you read the report, it goes a long way in at least somewhat bridging that gap.
Thanks, Zainab. Well, that is pretty much everything wrapped up. I think there's a clear call for aligning humanitarian action with emancipation across different settings in different forms. And this is really kind of coming throughout a lot of this. And we talk about rupture, mention of the inflection point, which is, you could say, the past 10 days, or you could say since October 7, or you could say over the past 10, 15 years. We are at a critical moment. And as Francesca Albanese talked about back in December, as some of the convening HPG is doing in the past few months, is this is not a moment to look inwards. It's not a moment to go into our shells, but we have to unite, we have to resist, and we have to challenge the structures of inequity and oppression. So on that note, this is a scoping study, a humanitarian trap. A QR code will come up. We encourage you to engage with it. It's going to be part of HPG's longer term work as we kind of navigate some of these tensions, these dynamics, trying to lift the discussion around humanitarianism. We think get rid of the blinkers, look further, look up, look down, and we look forward to being able to engage a lot of different actors across this process moving forward. So please reach out at any time. And perhaps most importantly, please fill out your forms. We are, despite all this discussion, our donors still like to see us having forms that are showing the impact of our work. So we'll wrap it up there, but thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists who have all been absolutely fantastic, despite dealing with a lot of turbulent times. So maybe a round of applause for the panelists. And last but not least, I caught the eye of my social media colleague. HPG is on Blue Sky. We are no longer on X, so please start to follow us on Blue Sky. And we are also on LinkedIn as well. We are quite active and there's quite fruitful discussion. So please join us on social media online. And we will leave it there. And thank you also to Trokra, who supported the research with funding and lots of active engagement, and also Irish Aid, who are behind this as well. So maybe we all need to channel some of the brilliant Irish Aid approaches to things. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.